Good morning. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. Today we have the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal and also the Highway 104 Western Alignment Committee as witnesses to discuss the Cobequid Pass. Begin with introductions, starting with Mr. McKay.
Good morning and welcome. Hugh McKay, MLA for Chester St. Margaret's.
Morning everyone. Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Benjamin Jessam here from Hammonds Plains, Lucasville. Morning, folks.
Good morning, MLA Suzanne Lonis-Croft, Lunenburg.
Morning, Gordon Wilson, MLA for Clare Digby.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning, Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville Cobequid.
Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, your chair. We have the Auditor General's office with us this morning. Mr. Spicer.
Terry Spicer, Deputy Auditor General.
And our guests, perhaps we'll start on the right with Ms. Saurette.
Diane Saurette, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. Peter Hackett, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Bruce Fitzner, Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, retired.
Morning, Eva Hislop, Highway 104 Corporation.
Okay, so we have an opportunity for you to both provide opening comments. Who would like to go first, or perhaps you just have one person making the opening comments? Mr. LaFleche.
I'll wait for the mic. I'll go first, and then I'm going to pass it very quickly to Peter Hackett. So you've introduced the people here, and I just, there may be some uncertainty as to why these look like the same people that regularly work for transportation. And the reason for that is Highway 104 Corporation is in fact owned by the government, the highway is, and the corporation is set up as a separate corporation, but for many years it's had one board of director member appointed by the minister. That was for the longest time Lee Rankin, one of my predecessors from the 1990s, and I'm looking over there and I don't think anyone will remember Lee. All of you are way too young, but Lee was around in the 90s and served as deputy minister, and when he retired, this was something that he took on as a favor to the minister of the day, and he did that for many years till about 2 years ago when things developed in Lee's personal life where he felt he could no longer continue. He lives in Bridgewater, and he's unable to come here today, or we would have had him actually here today, because we do have the replacement for Lee. We decided when Lee left that we would make the chief engineer of the department the chair of the board and the board member, because as has been well advertised, the corporation will probably wind up earlier than we thought, and we wanted to have some insight into how it runs on a daily basis. So at that time, this was Bruce Fitzner, and he was made the chair. And I know I promised you about a little over a year ago that Bruce was gone for good and wouldn't be back. So I have failed once again to deliver the goods for the public. He is back to torment you. Because he has some recent knowledge of the corporation, and he still does some work for the department on the wind-up of this corporation. The presentations we'll talk about later we will eventually make, we haven't made yet, and some other files. And so when Bruce retired, he was replaced by Peter Hackett as chief engineer. So Peter then took on the mantle of the board and chair of the corporation. And that's why he is here today next to me, but he's also the department's chief engineer. So Eva is in fact the only employee of the corporation that is here, and she is in charge of the finances along with my executive director of finance, Diane Saurette. So that's sort of the introduction to the corporation. It is owned by the government, despite, I think, a lot of confusion to the contrary, that it's owned by some other company. There are bondholders who represent national companies that we have bonds with, but the company is owned by the government. So without further ado, I'll let the whole board here speak to you.
Okay, Mr. Hackett.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to run through some things, some facts about the Cobequid Pass this morning, and give you some small details about how the pass is set up and what's happened with it over the last number of years and why it came to be. So that'll be my discussion here for the start off here this morning. As Paul said, Peter Hackett, I'm the chief engineer with the department. I'm also the president of the Highway 104 Corporation. The Cobequid Pass is a 45-kilometer section of 4-lane divided highway connecting Masstown and Thompson Station. It is part of the Trans-Canada Highway System. It's a primary highway corridor connecting Nova Scotia with the rest of Canada. The pass was opened in 1997 to replace the old Highway 104, which was a 2-lane undivided highway through the Wentworth Valley. The old Highway 104 still exists today, but is now called Trunk 4. It's a 2-lane collector arterial road still through the Wentworth Valley, but it's a trunk route. It's no longer a 100 series highway. The pass cost approximately $112 million to construct and took about 20 months to complete when it was built in 1997. More than half of the project funding was raised through the issuing of bonds and were sold to private investors. The funding raised through the bonds, which accounted for more than 50% of the initial construction cost, and those bonds are being paid now over a 30-year term, and they're being paid off through the collection of tolls on the pass. The Cobequid Pass is owned by the province and operated by the Highway 104 Corporation Western Alignment, or Western Alignment Corporation. It's a Crown agency. The corporation is mandated to the Highway 104 Western Alignment Act, which is legislated. It oversees the toll collections, financing, maintenance, operations, and all other work associated with the operation of the highway. The corporation is made up of 1 board member with 1 lone shareholder, which is the Minister of Transportation. The pass has 29 full-time and 17 part-time employees, as well as 10 contracted employees representing a total of 56 local jobs, which are mostly, these folks are mostly from the Cumberland, Colchester County areas. When the pass was opened in 1997, the average annual daily traffic on the old Highway 104 through the Wentworth Valley was about 9,000 vehicles per day. In 2019, the average annual traffic on the Cobequid Pass still remains about 9,000 vehicles per day, but there's now about 2,000 vehicles per day on the old highway, so roughly about 11,000 vehicles per day traveling through that area. The impetus to build the Cobequid Pass came under the government of the day when it was pressure to find a solution to address the large number of fatalities that were occurring through the Wentworth Valley at that time on the old highway. The solution was to construct a modern divided highway through the area that would create a safer, more efficient highway to replace the sections of the Wentworth Valley. The construction cost of this project, like I said before, was $112 or $113 million, which was a staggering number for one project considering that the entire amount for the provincial budget that year on average was about $17 million in capital cost. 75 million, sorry, in capital cost, which was well under the amount of actual cost of the price of the project. With mounting pressure to build a new safe highway, government decided to finance the project through a private-public partnership. The road was built in only 20 months. It was financed through a contribution of $27.5 million from the federal government and $27.5 million from the provincial government, and the remaining 50% was paid through bondholders. Like I said before, is being paid over 30 years through the tolls being collected. The province created the Highway 104 Western Alignment Corporation to operate the highway and to administer the financing. That's the agency. Over the past 20 years, the traffic volumes on the highway have outperformed the projected models, allowing the corporation to spend all toll increases since 2004. So the tolls right now are the same that they were in 2004, which is $4 for a passenger vehicle, and it's a $3 per axle per truck around that, and it hasn't changed since that time. There's also been funds collected in a reserve account, which will enable the province to repay the bondholder sooner than the 2026 date originally outlined in the agreements. The Cobequid Pass has achieved government's goal of providing a safer route through the Wentworth Valley. From 1987 to 1997, the number of fatal collisions on Highway 104 through the Wentworth Valley averaged about 3 per year. Since that opening of the Cobequid Pass in late 1997, the average number of fatality collisions has dropped to less than 1 per year. In fact, in many of the years since on the Cobequid Pass, there have been very few or no fatalities at all. There hasn't been a fatality on the old highway, I believe, in at least about 10 years, which is the old Trunk 4. The Cobequid Pass is also 9 kilometers shorter than the old Highway 104 and saves travelers approximately 16 minutes in drive time and reduces their vehicle operating costs in addition to offering enhanced safety. As a public-private partnership project, the Cobequid Pass is a successful story that many jurisdictions look towards to when they put their own projects together under P3s, when they want to go towards a very short time build on a major construction project. It's a very good success story for the province. The positive financial situation of the Cobequid Pass that we find ourselves in right now, the efficiency of the highway, and most of all, the enhanced safety, the reduction of loss of life, makes this project, I think, one that the Nova Scotians should be proud of. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hackett. Mr. Houston of the PC Caucus, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for those opening comments. I'm not sure who's the best person to address it, but I will just, Mr. Hackett. Can you just give us just quickly what's the plan to remove the tolls? When would the tolls come off as we sit here today, to the best of your knowledge?
Mr. Hackett?
So I couldn't tell you when the tolls will come off. I can only tell you where the financing is right now or where it stands, and Diane might be able to talk a little bit better about where we sit with that. But and I can pass it over to her in 1 second. But right now, it's projected that we could be in a position to pay off the bonds by 2019. The exact date, I couldn't actually tell you that, just because of things like the traffic volume is going to stay the same. Is there any issues that we have to cover for extra costs, construction, that sort of thing?
So what's the latest the tolls could be removed? Is that 2026? Is that 2026
is what the agreement states.
So they have to come off by 2026 or before?
Once again, I can't say about the tolls coming off. I can only talk about the bonds being paid, being ready to pay out the bondholders. And I don't know, Diane, if you want to mention.
Well, I'll probably get to the finances, okay. But I just want to, just as an overview, I guess, if I was to ask when would the tolls come off, 2026 would be the safest answer right now.
Well, if you, under the Highway 104 Act, the Western Alignment Act, it states under there, I think it's like paragraph 13.2, it basically states that the tolls are, may stay on in the event that there's other costs, such as maintenance, operations, administration, that sort of thing. It doesn't actually say the tolls will come off when the bonds are paid out or the capital is paid off.
Okay, fair enough. No, that's good. Just for some perspective, I wonder if we can say from inception, from the time the tolls first came on to today, how much toll revenue has been collected?
Ms. Saurette?
Is that something we'd have to hand?
Approximately $308 million.
Okay. How much principal is owed on the bonds right now?
If we look at last fiscal, so statements that are actually on the website, we're looking at approximately 38 million. 38
million principal. Yeah. And how much guaranteed interest is still owed on the bonds?
Okay, so that's an estimate. So, and it's based on market. So what we can get in the market today. So I think we're probably looking at somewhere between 17 and 18 million. Yeah.
Okay. So that would make the principal and interest in the neighborhood of 56 million.
Yeah, that would, yeah, that's fair.
And how much cash is on hand?
So on hand, when we look at the debt service reserve and the excess cash reserve, we're looking at about 37, 38 million.
Okay. So not necessarily enough cash on hand to pay all of the principal.
Yeah. So now I'm giving you numbers based on fiscal 16-17. So we still have to consider 17-18. We're projecting somewhere in the vicinity of $8.5 million in revenue. So if you add that to it, so where we're getting fiscal 19-20 is we're thinking, okay, we're going to have revenue if we stay status quo in 18-19. If we're looking at another, say, $8.5 million, what's in estimates for 17-18, that'll bring us into somewhere into the 19-20 fiscal year that will have enough cash on the balance sheet to look at the debt.
Okay. So is that the plan, when there's enough cash to extinguish the principal of the debt? Because this is something that kind of goes back and forth. Do we pay the debt early? Do we not pay the debt early? So if there's 38 million in cash on hand and 38 million in principal due, is that something the board talks about? Maybe Mr. Hackett, taking the cash on hand and paying the principal?
Ms. Saurette?
answer that. So we haven't, no decision by government has been made on that. So what the department is doing right now is just, so we know a commitment has been made to remove the toll for Nova Scotia motorists. So now we've been tasked with pulling all the information together as to what does that mean. There's multiple agreements that has to go through. We have to go through the legislation. We have a corporation to think about, and what does that mean where it's not a consolidated entity. We're looking at revenue. We have to project. We've got a couple more winter seasons that we're thinking that's likely, as well as any other additional maintenance or construction. So there's a lot to think about along with the agreements and legislation and that. So we've been tasked with bringing all that together and bringing it forward to government for them to make a decision.
And that's to make a decision on removing the tolls for Nova Scotians? Or make a decision on using the cash to pay the debt, or just making a decision on all those things? Like what are the decisions before the department right now?
There was a press release, press event by Minister McClellan when he was dealing with the whole issue of highway expansion. I believe it was last April. It's in your document, your package. And I think if you read that, you'll see what the government's intent was. And our job is to work towards that intent by providing the right factual information so the government can make an appropriate decision. But if you read the exact nature of that, it was that tolls would be relieved when the debt is paid off for Nova Scotia motorists. At this point, we haven't defined that. We're putting together, in fact, that's part of the job that Mr. Fitzner is working on to allow us to make presentations to Executive Council within the next year, maybe a little earlier, such that Executive Council on behalf of Nova Scotians can make the decisions regarding this. So it was rather unfair to say that things would only change in 2026. I think what Mr. Hackett was giving was the legal definition in the legislation, but the government has made an announcement. It's in the public, and they're to all instructions I have, even though the minister did change, and he's probably shorter and not as good looking, I hear, than the last one. We're still going to follow the instructions that we have, and the new minister has authorized us to put together a series of options with facts for government such that a decision can be made in the next year or so.
Well, there's a lot baked in that, but I guess what I'm trying to do is find out exactly what's baked in that, because your discussion started off about the government intent. And that Minister McClellan at the time said that the intent was to remove the tolls for Nova Scotian motorists. And then everything that you just said there talked about trying to get the information together to make the decision. So I think when government intent is something that nobody has any confidence in, because governments say things all the time. The intent was for the tolls to come off on this at 2019 at one time. And then Minister McClellan issued a letter saying, well, let's not pay the debt off till later, and then they said, let's take it off for Nova Scotians. So I guess what I'd like to do today is kind of cut through all that kind of rhetoric and actually see what is the plan. So if I were to break that down, I would ask a simple question: is the plan to remove tolls for Nova Scotians, and when? And that's a question I don't think you can answer, right?
Mr. LaFleche.
It's already been answered by the government. They said they would remove tolls when the debt is paid off. The current estimate of that was given to you by Ms. Saurette, and so we're working towards those instructions.
Well, okay, I might have missed the current estimate of when the debt will be paid off. Is that if there's 38 million in principal and 18 million of guaranteed interest? Let's first define when the debt is paid off. Would you define that as the principal plus the interest, or would you define that as just the principal?
Ms. Saurette?
I would define it as principal and interest in sometime in fiscal 19-20.
Okay. Yeah. So sometime in fiscal 19-20, roughly $56 million would be passed over and the debt would be paid off. Is that do I have that part right?
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sometime in fiscal 1920, $56 million would be handed over, the bonds would be extinguished, and the debt would be paid off. And at that stage, the tolls would be removed for Nova Scotians only, or the tolls would be removed?
So a commitment has been made to remove for Nova Scotia motorists, all other motorists, so trucks out of province. No decision has been made on that.
Okay, but for trucks, for Nova Scotian trucks with Nova Scotian plates, no toll. Is that the intent?
I believe the definition of a motorist would be cars, not trucks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so 2019, 2020, if you have a Nova Scotia car with Nova Scotia plates, the intent is no more toll. Any other type of vehicle, Nova Scotia plates or not, transport trucks, whatever, still toll?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
I think,
Mr. LaFleche.
I think, again, in your documentation, you have some quotes from Minister McClellan. I think what he said was that was the intent to remove for Nova Scotia motorists. The definition of a motorist in Nova Scotia is still yet to be known fully, but Mr. Saurette gave you as accurate a description as one has today. We will further work on that, but people who drive cars for recreational reasons obviously are Nova Scotia motorists. Then Minister McClellan added a comment that a decision will be made on trucks. Trucks writ large, could be Nova Scotia trucks, could be tractor trailers, could be out of province trucks, could be local delivery trucks. All of those are different circumstances. A decision will be made on those in due course when Ms. Saurette and Mr. Hackett and Mr. Fitzner have a package that is ready to be reviewed by Cabinet, and Cabinet has an opportunity to review that and make those decisions. So we cannot answer yet one way or the other whether an 18-wheeler, owned by Galen Weston Corporation coming from Brampton, Ontario, will have pay tolls or not. But we will know within about a year.
Thank you. When was it that Minister McClellan made this announcement? Do you remember roughly when that time was?
It's actually in the package. Why don't we look this up? Diane, you want to get the statement? There's a date to it in the package.
Mr. Fitzner may have a response.
Yeah, it was done in April. At the time they made the announcements on the toll highway feasibility study.
Okay. So it was made remarkably close to the beginning of the provincial election, I'd say. It was made pushing a year ago, not too far away from a year ago that announcement would have been made. And sounds like a lot wasn't really figured out before the decision was made, because a lot of things that were talked about in the announcement still aren't defined, right? So how close are we to defining these things? When would these decisions reasonably when can people reasonably expect these decisions to be made? Like we are a year after an announcement, and staff is working on a package to put to the minister, to put to Cabinet, to put to the legislature. How close are we to those types of decisions?
Mr. Hackett.
I would say probably within this year, so probably another year, another 12 months, we'll have an idea where we sit on that decision of what's going to be done. There are a lot of. It's not just a matter of paying out the bonds. There are other issues we have to go through as well, other contracts we have to look at, and other things that would affect other people and motorists on the path. So it's a fairly long process. So I would expect probably 12 months at least.
Okay.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, there's no ability right now under the existing agreements to selectively toll one vehicle going through the pass or not, is there? It's every vehicle gets tolled.
Right, at different rates.
At different rates. Right. And then this would be a switch from that, so that would require new agreements, I guess. But at that time, there'd be fewer agreements because the bonds would be paid off.
That's correct. And the interest of the bondholders wouldn't be there any longer, so it would be the agency and the government that would have to make the decisions of what they want to do going forward.
Okay. Is it too early to say, or has there been some analysis done that if the toll was removed, for Nova Scotia vehicles, however that's ultimately defined? Is there some different scenarios to say what the annual toll revenue would still be? How much of the revenue is coming from non-Nova Scotia vehicles at the moment?
Do we have that answer?
Ms. Saurette, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. So we know non-Nova Scotians, I don't have the truck numbers, but we know that approximately 20% of the toll revenue, so we're looking at toll revenues around between 18 and 19 million. It's almost 50-50 between cars and trucks. 20% of it is we're anticipating or estimating is from locals. So 50% from overall truck traffic, so that could be Nova Scotian and non-Nova Scotian trucks. And then there's 30% that is Nova Scotian motorists and out-of-province motorists.
Okay.
So that's roughly the percentages.
Okay.
Right now we're we've only just in the last, I think, and this is one of the pieces to try to define the revenue and where the revenue comes, is monitoring the traffic that's at the pass. So we've only just gotten the technology in the last couple of months, and that's another one of the big pieces of, you know, what is all the revenue and where it's all coming from. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. In the 2016-2017 budget, there was $10 million that was contributed to the provincial coffers as a result of the pass. Was that, like, is there a check cut for that? Like, does $10 million actually flow into the provincial coffers, or is it just some type of paper
No, it's so the pass itself is one of the GBEs. So it's one of the 4 GBEs in government. So you've got your Liquor Commission, your Gaming Corp, GBE, yeah. Government business entity, sorry. So they're non-consolidated entities. So how we recognize is just their income, their bottom line through the equity method. So this is one of them. So we recognize the revenue, but the revenue, the cash, because this is legislated toll, like our Halifax-Dartmouth Bridge Commission, it stays on the books of the province. So that's, or of the company, sorry. So that's why it has so much cash on its balance sheet. So it's a non-consolidated, so that's not the bank account of the province.
Okay, thank you. The corporation has an obligation to hand over the highway back to the province when all the agreements are said and done. They have an obligation to hand it over in a certain condition. Is it in that condition today? Would it meet that test today?
I'll let Peter answer that one.
Mr. Hackett?
So over the last, yeah, so you are correct that the highway has to be handed over in basically the same condition it was in when it was built. And over the last 5 years, the pass has put in roughly $25 million in that range towards capital. So they've repaved the entire pass from the full 45 kilometers, and we've put a few $1 million into bridge structures as well. So if the pass was handed over today, it's back in really good condition. The pass is also monitored by an independent engineer, which monitors the pass every 3 months and gives us a report. And so anything in that independent engineer report has to be done within a short period of time. So they're always on top of the maintenance on that road as well, to be under that contractual agreement to have an independent engineer. Is it in better shape than the other 100 series highways? Like, I would say yes, and the reason it's in better shape than the other 100 series is because of the agreements. So because of the agreement that's written, the highway has to be kept in a certain standard under that contract. And the rest of the province, we have our budgets, and it's spread across all the highways across the province, and we keep a very good level of service on our 100 series highways as well, an excellent level of service for that matter. But because that's under a contract, it's always they're always on top of it because of the contractual agreements. So there's more spent on maintenance on that stretch than pretty much anywhere else, or I couldn't say that for sure, but there is a fair amount of money spent on that highway. I mean, other highways get as much maintenance spent on it, but it's not done always as quickly because of the agreements that are in the pass. Okay.
You still have 1 minute remaining.
Oh, good, thank you. Does the 56 employees working for the corporation, is there any plan for those employees once the corporation's been wound up in 7 or 8 years? Is that something that's been discussed?
Yeah, so not yet. I mean, that would be part of the discussion that we'd be having over the next little while, and the future of the pass as well. If tolls are kept on for out-of-province motorists and trucks, then we'd have to consider, you know, what the agency would look like and what the employee contribution would look like. So there really hasn't been any discussion about that yet. Right now it's still business as usual as far as we know. So we'll be looking at that as time moves forward. There's a few managers, accountants, toll collectors. We have folks doing some maintenance up there, independent engineers, that sort of thing. So there's a variety of staff up there that we'd have to look at.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and the Honourable Dave Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. And it's definitely an interesting topic to many who especially who travel that area of the province, and for some years now have been paying the tolls. And you know, a lot of Nova Scotians are interested in the discussion over the last year or so on the removal of the tolls. And I think often once they started to hear that, the assumption is toll booths will come down and the road will be open and there won't be any more charges to motorists. But obviously that may not be the end game here, and I think Nova Scotians, you know, should be provided as much information as possible through this process so that they know what the intent of the government is. To what degree do you have the ability to make suggestions to the minister? I mean, when I look at this, I clearly see this as it's going to be a political decision. The minister ultimately will be the person, whoever he or she is at the time, to make the announcement of exactly what's going to happen. And so to what degree do you have the ability to bring suggestions to the government? Have you been asked to bring a number of examples of what post-removing tolls for whoever looks like in a few years? Do you have that ability, or are you being instructed on this is what we need from you? We'll make the decision as a government, as a cabinet, as a minister, or with the deputy minister.
Mr. LaFleche.
So as you know, we never shy from being controversial here, so we're not going to be shy from that with our own minister. So we have said to our minister and the previous minister, Mr. McClellan, when he made the announcement, which is now before you and was in your package, you can read it, that we will be bringing a full range of options. Like, our job as civil servants is to bring every option from, you know, keeping things going forever to winding her up as soon as we can legally wind her up. And I'll get to that a little later on how long that would take, even if we started today. So we'll bring a full range of options and so that they can consider, and that's why some of those definitions that Mr. Houston asked about here are not set in stone, because there is some degree of ambiguity around some of them, and we'll have to show the government what the effect of moving that ambiguity one way or another would be. Again, it's not to in any way fail to commit to the statement which Mr. McClellan has made. The Premier has committed to that. The current minister has reaffirmed that commitment, and we will be doing that. But that statement, as it says there, does leave open issues related to ongoing maintenance, non-Nova Scotia residents, and commercial truckers. So Ms. Saurette, in fact, along with Ms. Bruce Fitzner, will be putting together a number of options around that and a number of scenarios regarding revenue or no revenue, which will be presented to Cabinet. And no, they have not in any way circumscribed our ability to present those options, other than that those options must focus on removing the tolls when the bonds are paid off for Nova Scotia motorists.
Would it be your understanding that that the government also wants to look at winding up the corporation and turning everything back over to the department, for example? Is that, or is that not? Is that going to be in part of what you bring forward to government?
Yeah, that whole scenario of what exists in the future will be brought forward to government in terms of different options. And you want to speak to that, Diane?
Yeah.
Ms. Saurette?
Yeah, so that could definitely be one of the options. But with that option is then we have an existing highway that what do we do with it, right? Because ongoing maintenance, operation, capital upgrades, and if we cease tolls, what do we do with that? And that's just part of the bigger, work and review that we're looking at for all the options, whether it's a break even or if we don't cease tolls or what it could look like.
So you haven't been given any concrete terms of reference saying these are your parameters, don't go outside that. Am I hearing that correctly?
Mr. LaFleche?
The only parameter is that when the bonds are paid off, as it states in the press release, the tolls will come off for Nova Scotia motorists. Okay, so that's the only parameter. Other than that, it's completely free. And Mr. Houston, I didn't want to waste his time earlier with one of my long answers. I was going to waste, I was going to waste my buddy over here, Suzanne's time. He made some astute comments and asked some good questions regarding the maintenance and the legislation. So I'll get to the legislation later. But the maintenance, if this highway were to be integrated back into the Nova Scotia system writ large, just, we folded everything up, that's one option, and it just folds back into the system, then there's the whole question that comes out of around maintenance. Not only, repaving and that type of capital maintenance, but also daily maintenance, snow plowing, salting, things like that. And how does it get back in our system, and how does our system absorb it? So those are all big questions which Ms. Saurette and Mr. Fitzner will be working to present options on to government. So we have not been given any parameters around that. Mr. Fitzner has a long experience in that area. In fact, I think at one time he worked in the Pass area as the manager there. He's well equipped to know the ins and outs of that, which are details that we wouldn't expect politicians to focus on. But Nova Scotia motorists, when they're driving the highway, may focus on them.
Thank you for this. I'm trying to make sure I don't get off track from my colleague here who's made some comments. I'm glad to hear that, but the reality is, the government could come back tomorrow and indicate and play with what the minister or the previous minister said in the news release. It's like negotiations and looking at contracts. You can interpret it a certain way, and so can someone else. So it'll be interesting. So it's not as cut and dry as tolls are going to be off. Don't worry, everything's coming down. And I think Nova Scotians, initially thought that kind of was where we were heading. And I hope with the timeline, if the bond, the money and the revenue that we see and is projected that potentially that 2019-20 kind of timeline is a reality, it's interesting that it'll be close to an election, and let's be honest. It's there may be more of a political decision than a proper decision. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years. So you said there was 29 full-time employees, I believe I heard, and to what degree will they have input in engaging with management, with the chair, to say what they think might be? And if they all live and work in that area, to me that's an asset. They live in communities that have been affected by having a toll, but they've had a job. So are they going to be any part of the discussion? And if not, would you make them part of the discussion so that they have an avenue and a voice, just like someone who might live in Yarmouth, but the employees, I think, could bring some valuable information about, where we should go with how this looks in the future.
You raise a good point, and maybe Mr. Hackett or Ms. Hislop there can explain, break down the employees for us, because one of the things that's not realized is that the maintenance of the highway is contracted to the department. So Canadian Union of Public Employees, regular unionized staff, perform the maintenance on the Cobequid Pass, even though technically it's not part of our current system. And there's reasons for that, which Mr. Fitzner or Hackett can go into. So it's not just the commissionaires who collect the tolls. It's not just the administrative staff like Ms. Hislop. There's also the maintenance workers. And there'll be a need for maintenance, and Mr. Houston pointed out, after the highway changes are put into effect, whatever those are. We'll still need to maintain the highway and plow it and repave it and ditch it and trench it, etc. So all of those things. Already CUPE, through their president, Mr. Joy, and their business agents have been quite vocal in and they're proud of the job they've done on the Cobequid, and they feel that they can compete against the private sector. So they're quite proud of the work, and they've made representations to the government during the toll discussion last year when of course, a decision was made not to toll, but they made representations there concerning their ability to do the work on any future upgraded or expanded twinned highways. And they're doing that about the Cobequid Pass now. So they do have an opportunity to do that. In terms of the other type of staff, maybe I'll let Mr. Hackett speak to that, the administrative and the commissioner staff.
Mr. Hackett?
Yes, just the breakdown here that Mr. Fitzner gave me. So there's 21 commissionaires that are full-time and 15 spares, and there's Acon Corporation runs the actual toll collection at the pass. So there's 8 full-time and 2 spares there with that company. And then there's contracted employees through the electrical firms and the maintenance firms that do work around the toll booth. So it's a fair amount of people working there right now. And to your point, Mr. Wilson, I think that it would be worthwhile talking to it will be worthwhile talking to the employees when we get to that stage. But as I mentioned earlier, right now we see things right now as business as usual. So we haven't gone to that step of saying this is what's going to happen or if anything will happen at all. So until that time really comes, then we'd have those discussions. And outside just the employees too, whatever the government decides to do with the tolls at the pass and the 104 Corporation, there are other stakeholders outside the employees as well that use the highway, and then we'd have to consult with those folks as well going forward too. So those consultations will take place.
No, that's good to hear.
Mr. LaFleche.
Just sorry, I asked Mr. Hackett to elaborate. So if you look at the ones, the employees, let's say that tolls completely came off. Not saying that, but let's say it did happen. The toll booths are ceremoniously hacked to pieces in a big party, and which is what happened in certain areas of Canada I used to live in when the tolls came off. So we'd still need all the employees who do regular maintenance operations. So my question, I get a question sometimes. My question to Mr. Hackett is how many employees actually, if we just eliminated the toll booth and the administration of the toll collection, how many would remain or how many would be no longer required?
Mr. Hackett?
Well, if you're looking at getting rid of the toll booth and you wouldn't have any collection and you close down the agency, then you probably only need about 10 employees to remain to actually maintain the pass. That would be mostly from our staff, right? It'd be internal.
Yeah. So we're hearing that one of the options may be, if you interpret the minister or previous minister's comments about Nova Scotia motorists, so we could potentially see some kind of toll for industrial trucks or commercial trucks out of province motorists or commercial motors. Is there anything? And I know over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of work done on a regional basis to around trade and open up the borders. And is there anything that you're aware of that would have New Brunswick, for example, say no, that's unfair? You can't just tax or toll or charge a New Brunswick company in how regionally the governments have been trying to work together in Atlantic Canada, for example. Is there anything that stands out that maybe we can't or shouldn't toll or charge out of province vehicles in Nova Scotia, or do we have the full authority to say, yeah, no, we'll do that and we'll live with whatever happens down the road?
Mr. Fitzner.
So there is an area that we haven't looked at in depth yet, but that we'll have to look at, and it's just with respect to mobility rights of Canadians to be able to work in other provinces. And so we haven't had the chance yet to delve into that in detail, but that is an issue that we'll have to have a look at.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I want to go to an area that I know of was a lot of concern a number of years ago, and of course that was one of the winter storms that happened, and there were stranded motorists for some time, and you know, in my previous career, I you know, if I was in that area, I would have been, you know, fully into trying to help them. So how, you know, the response, I think, to what I've seen has been appropriate. Are those I think relationships and those agreements with outside agencies still in effect on and I know the closure rates, you know, the potential to close it down sooner than later are there, but are there still agreements with organizations in and around the area to support if we ever seen a storm hit like we did before? Or was that just kind of a one-off for that right after that storm? It kind of, we haven't seen it again, but the potential is there, right?
Mr. Fitzner.
Yes, so basically at the time that happened and all the tractor trailers started jackknifing on the hills and it got blocked off and people spent the night there. We had 2 consultants come in and do separate reports on all the mitigative measures that we could put in place. And one of the largest ones was, you know, to prevent people from continuing to go into that situation when they know there's a problem there. There was no way to do it. So we set up a number of protocols. We got the overhead signs in place. There was, I think there was 38 different measures that were all enacted based on those reports. And even, and every year we do a drill. They have a protocol in the local offices of what you do when you close the highways. There's degrees of authority on that, so certain people have to have the authority to make those decisions, and they're tied in very closely with EMO and that type of thing. So it was a very sensitive issue at the time, continues to be now, and the guys up there that work on that do stay on top of that.
So does it come down to eventually to the minister decision, or connected with maybe EMO to close it down? Because I mean, we all know, you know, with severe weather and any closure of that highway cuts our province off from some supplies, and there's always talk about you know, being prepared for that. So is there work being done to ensure that if that happens, there's alternatives to ensuring that we continue to get the product we need to sustain, you know, gasoline for one? You know, it doesn't take long for a pending storm to currently see our gas stations run out of gas, and the Cobequid Pass is still open and remains open. So are there is that work being done to make sure that we have options in case there's a long period of shutdown on the pass?
So basically, the level of authority, just get back to your first question, is in the district level. So the district director there right on the ground has the ability to shut the pass down. They don't do it lightly for the reasons that you give. It's our main corridor in and out of the province. And the detour routes have all been set up, and mostly the main detour route is the old 104 highway, which has been maintained quite well in itself and been repaved, and there's a lot of passing lanes and that type of stuff on it. So there's basically a parallel highway there, which is a good setup for something happens on one highway, you can divert to the other.
I still have another minute remaining if you wish.
I think I'm good. We'll pass her on.
We'll move to the Liberal Caucus, and we're going to go, well, there's two people who are asking, so. Mr. McGuire? And Mr. McGuire, please adjust your mic there so we can hear you.
Okay. Thanks for being here today, and there's a lot of interesting information. So I've heard on more than one occasion that the monies that are pulled in from the tolls and also from gas tax, and let's just talk about gas tax and motor vehicle revenue, that this can cover all maintenance and expansion, snow removal, ditching, everything that we do. Does this cover our current stock, and would that money cover the Cobequid Pass if we remove the tolls?
Ms. Saurette?
I can answer that one. So currently right now, between RMV revenues and gas tax, we actually run a deficit when we look at overall maintenance of our highway system on an annual basis. This year, I think it's somewhere around $30 million. And if you go over the last 10 years, there's, actually we've got the numbers here. It's 29.9 is what we're potentially forecasting for this year. But in some years, we were up to 75 to 100 million, where the actual funding that went into the system exceeded what we bring in RMV and gas tax. But with relation to Cobequid Pass, so maintenance and operations and capital and all of that come from toll revenue. So when we look at the $308 million that has been received over the last 21 years in toll revenue, that covers the financing, it covers maintenance, operation, capital, everything that's gone into that system over the last 21 years. Gas tax and RMV revenues would not have covered any of that. So if the tolls came off, then we'd actually be in a situation of either absorbing it into the current budget or increasing budget. So. Oh, do you want to talk about that? Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to pass it on to Paul to talk about the difference between the two different gas taxes, because we got provincial gas tax and then we've got the federal gas
so
tax.
So it's safe to say, though, that if the tolls are removed, we are currently running a deficit when it comes to motor vehicle registration revenue and gas taxes on our current stock of road. If we add another section of road that essentially is paying for itself through the tolls, then we are going to run an even larger deficit when it comes to maintenance and repair.
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mr. LaFleche?
The one point I wanted to make is when people go to the pump and they look at that little division of taxes on there, we're not talking about the federal gas tax, which goes to the federal government and is then partially refunded to municipalities, not the province. So that gas tax, when you see it on the pump, has nothing to do with us. The province does not get that tax in the end.
So how do you determine the tolls? How do you determine if the tolls go up, if they stay the same? My understanding is that the tolls haven't increased, you've said this earlier, since 2014. 2004, sorry. So that's, you know, I wish we could say that about the bridge, but how do you determine if we do an increase in the tolls? And why hasn't it been increased? Why has it stayed the same since 2004?
Okay, Ms. Hislop.
So our tolls are based on arrangements that we have. Our tolls are based on arrangements that we have with our bondholders. So if we meet certain debt covenant ratios, then we do not have to raise the tolls. So we've been fortunate enough to manage our finances so that we're able to meet those ratios. So we're able to keep the tolls the same.
So do you consider the Cobequid Pass project a success? And if so, what are the factors that make it a success? And if not, what are those factors also? Are there outside jurisdictions looking at this? I know that you know, it's our project, and by our, I mean Nova Scotia's project. So we're more likely to pat ourselves on the back and say this is success. But do we have other jurisdictions that have looked at this and say, okay, that's a model that we appreciate and would like to copy?
Mr. Hackett.
Yeah, so on the I guess when you rate the success from the highway point of view, it's been a success for the reduction of fatalities. So the old highway was the actual reason why they built a new highway, because of the amount of fatal collisions that we were having on that highway. So with a large reduction, a very large percentage of reduction of fatal collisions, that itself is a huge success for a new road. So I think that's the positive thing from the highway department. When you look at the actual financing model, where there's an agency that's arm's length of government, or part of government, I guess, in some ways, but arm's length of government, that runs its own toll collection and own payment of bonds, and basically has no risk to government. It's sort of independent of its own. That highway's been running itself for the last 20 years without really much intervention from the province. And so from that alone, it's been able to do all of its bond payoffs, it's been able to do its own financing, its own maintenance, its own capital, which is in itself is a huge success. And to your point about other jurisdictions do look at this model. I don't know how many have implemented that same model. I'm sure there's some, but in some jurisdictions, particularly in the United States, companies will come in and do that type of this type of model, but independent of government. And if they go bankrupt, then the government is stuck holding the actual cost of the highway. In this case, that's not the case, where the agency is sort of responsible for it and the government's sort of hands-free. So because there's been very little interaction from government, there's been, it's basically been self-contained, self-independent, and you've got a great highway up there. I think overall it's been a good success.
So ultimately, I mean, keeping in mind that we are stewards of taxpayer dollars, and we got to make sure that it's being spent correctly, but ultimately, would you define success as, I would hope you would, as saving lives? So we have a piece of highway that had a pretty horrendous nickname. It was Death Valley. Death Valley. Yeah. I haven't heard that term since we've had conversations not too long ago. So ultimately, you're saying that this has saved lives. So when you go to bed at night, are you at ease with this strip of highway and the success that you've had from a human life standpoint?
So to go back to that, obviously I wasn't here back when the pass went in. Bruce was here. Bruce
has been here since the beginning of time. Let's not kid ourselves.
And I can't take credit for the actual construction and the foresight to putting this highway together. But I think if you're back in 1993 and 1994 and you're looking at your budget and you're looking at the amount of lives that are being lost on the Folly Mountain Road, which I say was averaging 3 fatal collisions a year, but that could be more fatals. That's just the matter of collisions that they had, that there's a fatality involved. So I think the actual number was around 50 fatals over that 10-year period. And so when you look at that success, and now you're at less than 1 fatal collision a year on a new highway, with more traffic increasing all the time, I think from that part of it, you're looking at a very good success rate for saving the lives of Nova Scotians and all those people that actually use that highway. And it's the saving the lives is the big thing, but it's also a more efficient road. It's a 4-lane twinned highway, higher speed limit, and it's shorter. So it's 9 kilometers shorter than the previous highway. So all of those things connected for transportation network, I would say it would be a success story for sure.
Ms. Saurette?
I'd like to add to that as well. Hate to go to the finance piece of it, but because our mandate really is to have safe highways, and that's really the ultimate success of this. But when we look at this pass and being able to do this road in 20 months, cost at $113 million, being able to access some federal funds, looking at a model where we're actually in a really unique situation to be ahead of the 30-year schedule. And we look at it and we compare it to the other part of 104, where we've opened, I think, approximately 15 kilometers over 15 years that cost us $175 million. When you look at the finance piece of it, if we hadn't gone through this type of a model, traditionally it would have taken us a hell of a lot. It would have taken us longer. Excuse me, I apologize. Would have taken us longer. I might not have a job when I go back to the office, but it would have taken us a lot longer traditionally than 20 months. And then we look at cost and cost escalation and that. So from a financial perspective, it's a success.
So we have a road that's come in, well, it's safer. It was built on time, on budget, faster than any other piece of road essentially that we've had. What's the difference? Like, so you're just saying, like, if we would have built this traditionally, it would have cost more and it would have taken longer.
So when we look at, it's 45 kilometers of twin highway, we might still be, like when we looked at the budget of the day and what we had in capital budget, to be able to do it on our own traditionally, it would just take a longer period of time. And when you think of just escalation and cost over, access to funds and building it quicker, risk transfer, there's a lot of different pieces that you consider when you're looking at this kind of model. But
so from a finance standpoint, in your eyes, this has been a fairly large success.
Mr. Fitzner would like to comment.
Yeah, just on that.
Mr. Fitzner, just wait till the mic comes on.
Traditionally, what we do is we'll build sections of highway as we twin them. And, you know, if you get so much money in your budget, you can do 5 kilometers. And if you're generally twinning a road, then as you build that 5 kilometers, you're able to put it into service, so it's useful to someone. In this particular case, they were going with a brand new alignment for all 4 lanes. So we weren't twinning the old highway. They didn't really like the terrain and that went through, so they moved to the western alignment, as they call it. And so in order, it just went right through the countryside, and really, until you had the whole 45 kilometers built, and that's 92-lane highways, basically 90 kilometers, the road wasn't very much good to anybody. So on our traditional builds, you know, with a small amount of capital available each year, we would have been in the woods for 10 or 15 years, nobody ever really seeing the highway until it comes out in daylight on the other end of the thing. So it was the type of thing that, like she mentioned, they did it in 20 months. And just an example, like the recent one we opened up in Antigonish, which was traditional type, that was 16 kilometers that we built. And the actual construction portion of that was about 8 years. So, you know, it delivered the goods very quickly. So getting back to your success, you know, the question on success, in that regards, it addressed the safety issue in probably the record time in this province.
So I just want to go over the toll removal. I have a quote that says, "We want to give Nova Scotia motorists a break as we move closer to 2019. We'll look at how we'll maintain this crucial piece of infrastructure," said Minister McClellan. The province will also be removing tolls from the Cobequid Pass for Nova Scotia motorists once the bonds are paid off. So the 2019 has been floated out there a few times, 2019, 2020. I guess this would probably for the finance department. The indicators right now are saying what? Is there potential for 2019, or are we, you know, 2022, 2026? What are your financial indicators showing?
Ms. Saurette?
For the bonds to be paid off?
Yeah, right now, if we look at status quo, where we're at in terms of the year end for 16-17, so the last statements, and looking at the revenue that we're going to achieve this fiscal year, what we're anticipating for next year, we're likely looking at fiscal 19-20. But you have to consider we've got a couple more winter seasons, so this year, next year to go through, what other types of maintenance we're looking at the revenue. Like so there's a few things that has to be considered, but you know, we're looking at it's likely going to be, we're going to be in that situation in 1920.
So this has little to do with an election and more to with potential election and more to do with the actual revenues of the Cobequid Pass and the some of the factors that we can't control, like maintenance and weather.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you kind of give me a quick breakdown of the revenue that is pulled in yearly by the Cobequid Pass and where that money goes?
Yeah.
So if we're pulling in, I think you said around $8.5 million a year.
So
some of that obviously is going to employment.
Yeah, so in toll revenue, we collect somewhere, actually, maybe I'll let Eva speak to that, where she's more closer to the finances than I am.
Ms. Hislop?
Yes, certainly. So yeah, in toll revenue, we're at about 19 million for last year. And just give me a second here and I'll...
Pardon me, how much?
And...
Yeah, do you want... I've got the numbers here.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Ms. Saurette?
Yeah, so toll revenue is approximately 19 million, and so it's mostly 50-50 cars and trucks. And expenses, so maintenance, any of the financing, depreciation on the pass is to the tune of somewhere around 12 million, a little over $12 million, so in total. So there's insurance, there's all kinds of different types. There's, we've got salaries, we've got just the regular maintenance and that of the pass, so that's about $12 million, a little over 12 million.
What's the amount of monies that goes into salaries yearly? Do you have that number?
Oh.
I know you said...
Yeah.
Just for the Cobequid Pass?
Just for the pass. It's actually a little bit difficult, but just because we've got maintenance, and maintenance is related to a contract that we have with the department, but salaries are about 700,000.
And would you say the majority of those individuals are people that are employed locally?
Oh.
So those are going into local economies.
Ms. Hislop, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Certainly, yes. Most of it is local, yes. Yep.
So take us through like what happens. There's two more questions I have around the tolls. Take us through what it would look like if these tolls were removed and what kind of impact it would have on the overall structure of the Cobequid Pass. And why haven't you made a decision on trucks? So what's the difference between having a truck and a vehicle on the Cobequid Pass?
Mr. Hackett?
So there's two questions there. You pull the tolls off.
So on the toll part, I guess as we mentioned earlier, what that would look like, we're still working on how that would be going forward.
When did you start the process of
looking at taking the tolls off? We're starting that now.
Okay.
So as I mentioned before, it'd probably take about a year before we have a decision of what that would look like going forward. And then once we make a decision, I guess we'll determine what the toll collection would look like and what the revenue would look like and that sort of thing. So that'll take some time to determine that.
Will there be some more public consultation on this? Will you be? I know that I think Mr. Fitzner has done some public consultation on the Cobequid Pass.
I think there'll be some public consultation with regard to the stakeholders involved. So if it's the trucking industry, the local community, again, sort of similar to what they did when they opened the pass back in 1996. They had public consultation about how this would look and how it would affect the local community, how trucks would, trucks right now aren't permitted to go through Highway 104, or the old Highway 104, Trunk 4, unless it's an emergency. So what would that look like? And so there's a number of different scenarios we have to look at as we're going through this process.
Maybe, Mr. Fitzner, could you give us some snippets of what you heard when you were out there in the public?
Mr. Fitzner.
Well, basically, it was kind of all over the map when I was out there speaking. It depended on the area and it depended on the crowd that night. But certainly, suffice to say, there was mixed opinions on the use of tolls, right? But a decision on that was made by the government, so I don't really want to get into that too much. But I just mentioned on the trucks themselves that the trucks, as Diane mentioned, and the cars roughly account for about 50% of the revenue. But as far as the damage caused to highways, trucks are the predominant means that highways start to break down, that the pavement ruts, and that you have to go in and do the expensive rehabs. And a rule of thumb that they've used for probably since the 50s through research that they've done in the States is that the damage of one truck is equivalent to 10,000 cars driving over the road. And that's because the weight of a vehicle and the damage it does is not linear. It's sort of an exponential, so it's to the power of 4. So for every pound you add on a vehicle, you multiply that by a pound, by a pound, by a pound, by a pound, to the 4th power, and that's what gets. So the trucks really do all the damage to the pass. So that's one of the considerations that when we look at whether tolls are coming off on trucks and that type of thing.
Time has expired for the Liberal caucus. We'll move back to the PC caucus. Mr. Houston, you have 14 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's talk trunk 4. Speed limit on trunk 4. It's a source of annoyance for a lot of people. So the corporation's agreement, I believe, says that the posted speed limit on trunk 4 is a weighted average calculation that is not less than 30 kilometers lower than the speed limit on the pass, right? So not less than at least 30 kilometers lower, which I guess would be 80. And the speed limit on well, what is the weighted average speed limit on trunk 4?
Mr. Hackett?
Couldn't tell you what the weighted average is right now. I don't know if I can get to that information, what it would be, because it goes over time.
Somewhere around 70 for the most part.
70 was what I was going to suggest, yeah.
So that's a slower speed for sure. There's a lot of enforcement on that area. You guys don't have any say as a department on the amount of enforcement on that stretch, do you?
We have enforcement on both roads, actually, so because they're still public highways, and both the Cobequid Pass and Trunk 4, so our enforcement officers work on both. They do work on Trunk 4. There is trucks aren't permitted on Trunk 4, provided on the size of the truck, so there is enforcement for that, and there is the speed part of it as well, but the speed is all regulated, so the speeds are up, and it's up to the RCMP basically to enforce the speed. But for the trucks, we do the truck enforcement. Yes.
Can the department influence how much RCMP enforcement is on that stretch?
Not normally. I mean, we could recommend that they go out, but we wouldn't. They don't necessarily take that into account. They do it with. I've heard
there's like 40 hours of RCMP enforcement on that stretch a week, but
that could be. I guess that would be up to them. Yeah, I don't.
Mr. Fitzner has a.
Yeah, so not so much with the RCMP, but on the commercial vehicle compliance. They actually, the pass has a contract with them to do a certain amount of extra patrolling to ensure that the trucks don't use that thing. So there is a payment each year that goes to the government for us doing extra patrols for the trucking.
Okay, that's interesting. So the corporation pays the province to put additional enforcement on that stretch. Yes. Okay. So when the tolls come off.
Just the trucks, not the RCMP.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Good distinction. When the tolls come off, which is the intent to do at some point for some vehicles, well, when the tolls come off, will the province raise the speed limit on trunk 4?
Mr. Hackett?
So that will be part of the process that we're going to do for the next year. We'll look at what that would look like going forward. It would be, it would be more ideal to keep trucks on Highway 104, only because of the fact that when we repaved and redid Trunk 4 over the last number of years, it's a trunk road. It can take trucks, but we prefer to sort of keep the main trucking on Highway 104 as opposed to going through the Wentworth Valley, just because the road has been it's been reworked and it's in great shape, and it's been widened in some areas, and we've taken some climbing lanes out in others, and it's more of a collector road than it is a 100 series highway. So I'm not saying that we would ban trucks from that road. I'm not saying that we change the speed limit. I'm just saying that that's something we're going to look at as part of this process going forward.
So that's important, because when the debt is paid and the principal and the guaranteed interest are all paid and the agreement's kind of done with the bondholders, that gives the flexibility to change things up on the tolls. Now, I've heard this morning that flexibility may mean off on passenger cars, still on trucks, who knows, any variety of things. So there is a scenario where there would still be a toll for commercial vehicles and trucks on the pass, but really there wouldn't be that contractual restriction to keep the trucks off the trunk anymore. But there may be a desire to do that, which would be different than other areas. So there's a lot of moving parts there, right?
Yeah. It is true. It would be desired to keep the trucks off just for a couple of things. One, for the safety, and one for the fact of the road construction, because it's a different design. And the trunk 4 is also, it's not controlled access anymore. It may have had pieces of it, but there's a lot of entrances and access. So the safety of that road would be better just for passenger vehicles or smaller trucks. The old highway is 9 kilometers longer, so the new highway is much shorter. So it would be more efficient for trucks to use the Cobequid Pass than the. But
if they have to pay a toll on that one, and so that's an interesting decision point for the department.
And the other decision, I guess, the other decision on that would be the speed limit, because the speeds may not be dictated anymore by a contract, but they may be dictated by the actual road itself. And would you put a speed limit up to 100 kilometers an hour on trunk 4 when really the safe speed is 80? And that's something that our traffic division would have to review before we ever change the speed limit as well.
So will the department commit to doing that safety study on that and looking at the speed limit? Or
if all these scenarios come forth and we start looking at this sort of thing, we would have to look at the safety of trunk 4 and what traffic we're going to put on that highway, because obviously the traffic, the majority of the traffic was taken off that highway for safety purposes. So to open it back up for more traffic, we'd have to consider that, because that was the purpose originally, to make the road safe.
In terms of the gas tax revenue, we had a little bit of talk about the gas tax. So between the gas tax and the vehicle license registration fees, $370 million a year. Actual spending on roads, $400 million a year, 30 million a year in the difference. So money's collected, certain money goes out. So that 30 million is coming out of the general. So on a $10 billion provincial budget, there's like 30 that's allocated for roads. Basically, is what's happening. It's not a lot, for sure, but. Looking forward into the future, when we start to look at cars being more efficient, more electric cars maybe, that will have an impact on the gas tax revenue. Has the department thought about what might happen to gas tax revenue and how roads would be financed? If we're all driving electric cars in the not too distant future, there won't be any gas tax revenue. Is that something the department's thinking about?
Mr. Fitzner.
Yeah, we've given it a little bit of thought, not so much as some of the places in the States like California and these type of people are now starting to look at how they're going to raise that revenue that they had from gas tax for exactly that reason. People are moving to electric cars, they're more fuel efficient cars, and the numbers keep dropping every year. And so that's going to be a consideration. It won't happen here as quickly, but at some point in time that will become an issue of a declining source of revenue in the from vehicles. Yeah.
So is there some secret spreadsheet somewhere that says we better look at our revenue mix and how we're going to pay for roads 10 years from now? It's not that far away that these things could have a big impact on the revenue collected. Are we looking forward like that?
Ms. Saurette.
Diane, take that one.
Hi. I don't have a secret spreadsheet or anything like that. I've got too much other stuff on my plate. But this might actually be a Department of Finance and the Revenue Division and what they're looking at in terms of all the revenue that comes into the province. So this revenue actually goes centrally, so it doesn't come to the department. So we just get our appropriation through our operating budget and our capital budget, and we allocate out the budget, based on, our mandate. But the revenue itself comes into finance and it goes centrally. So, yeah.
Sorry, Mr. LaFleche.
Yeah, I just want to state, at the Transportation Association of Canada and the National Deputies Committee, which we serve on, and Peter is the Chief Engineer Rep for us, there's a lot of discussion about those things, electric cars. The rate paid now in many jurisdictions for charging electric car is very low. It doesn't reflect true costs, and it's sort of a teaser rate to get people into the business. So we're discussing across Canada, across North America. There are a lot of discussions on that whole issue. What do you charge for electric recharges? What will the future be there? What happens to the gas tax? How do you finance road construction? Because, we're a small jurisdiction in North America, but there are others that are grappling with this on a bigger basis. The whole way of funding their highway system in the United States could dramatically change. In fact, I don't want to alarm anybody here and cause nightmares tonight among some of you, but, tolls for that reason in other jurisdictions, not Nova Scotia, other jurisdictions, could become more prevalent for what the reasons you're talking about. But all of that discussion is going on nationally. No one has a secret playbook. There's no need for Mariki, who's downstairs listening, to FOIPOP anything yet. We don't have anything for her. Oh, there she is right there. Okay. You don't have to drop the camera and run. Those discussions are, in fact, are very public, and they're done, all across North America. The scene is changing dramatically. You raise great questions, and we are going to have to prepare ourselves for those.
Okay, thank you for that. In terms of the twinning projects that have been announced, what's the time frame for the project through Marshy Hope on the 104?
Mr. Hackett.
So right now we're working on the design of that highway, and as well as the engineering for it, and trying to get ourselves looking at a tender process. But we have a fair amount of information to collect over the next 12 months. A lot of geotechnical information and a lot of design work to be done, bridge work and alignment work. So we're hoping that sometime in late 2019 would be when the project should start, or around the same time a tender would be closed. So that's what we're looking at.
No, that's helpful. And then would that take how long would it take to build it?
It depends on the process. It depends how the department wants to go about doing that. So it probably somewhere between 3 to 5 years, I would think, to build
that's helpful. Thank you. Now, as you look at the design phase of these projects and all these other types of factors, is the department considering or looking at going to a wider median like they have in New Brunswick?
It's something that we've looked at. It's not a bad design. But it depends on the actual location if you have the land. And so right now in these twinning projects that we have at the moment, other than the one probably through Marshy Hope, everything is, the land is all bought parallel to the highway. So the existing median design that we have is probably the best way to go to twin. Now, if you're going through Marshy Hope or around Marshy Hope is what we're looking at for design. If the land was available, it might be something we pull out of our toolbox.
Yeah, so there's nothing that prohibits you from doing that.
No, it's more of a land constraint thing.
And having a wider median often will allow you to follow the contours of the land and probably save you a lot in construction costs. So the discussion is how much does the land cost versus how much do you save, and so you're open to that?
We'd be open to it. We've had those discussions, and we've had discussions with our staff, and we've asked them to look at those potential options. But if it works, it's something we could look at. If it's something that we find it's more efficient to stay with the narrower median, then we'd go with that as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You have 1 minute remaining.
Okay, thank you. And the highways that have the wider ones, are they considered safer in the industry, or?
I don't think you'd really see them as being safer. There's some advantages to it. One, you don't have any headlights coming at you. You don't have any vehicles. You don't see the other vehicles, so to speak. Yeah, and there can be some grade separations as well. You do have a wider right-of-way to look after, obviously, and you have trees and something often in the middle of the right-of-way, which you kind of like to get away from that, to have trees too close to the highway for things like wildlife and collisions and clear zones.
Yeah.
So there is some plus and minuses to those highways. The ones in New Brunswick were built because they had a lot of land and it was all virgin material, so they just went in and did that design, where we're kind of in a little more constrained situation and sort of building on our old designs.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you have
You still have 20 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move to the NDP Caucus and Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. I'm going to start just trying to understand a little bit more the difference in how the Cobequid past was financed versus like this situation versus sort of general government financing. I mean, obviously there was a bond issue to raise the revenue. We also issue bonds to raise, to finance government generally. That's how we finance our government debt. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about the percentage of interest that was paid on this bond issue versus what would have been paid if it were just general government financing. And I don't know if Terry Spicer might want to chime in if I'm not making any sense.
Ms. Saurette?
Just having a bond is just a different form of financing. And so the bond rate is just a little over 10%. You can't compare it to the bond rate today. You have to compare it. It has to be relative to what potentially the government cost of borrowing would have been at that point in time. And I think you're probably looking at somewhere between 8 and 9%. So this bond is obviously higher than what the provincial government, if it had done it traditionally, and which is basically we do it. We just the government itself does it, the borrowing through the Department of Finance, and how all of that debt servicing and borrowing works. That's a little over my scope. I think when we go and we talk about traditionally as opposed to doing this a P3 option, is that we were able to get a larger stretch of road, 45 kilometers, 90 kilometers really, done in a shorter period of time. The risk transfer, we were able to transfer that risk onto the contractor. So in terms of escalation, all that, they bear that. So you pay a higher interest, but when we look at being able to get it done quickly, the safety, if we then compare it to doing it traditionally and how long it could have possibly taken us, what we have overall in terms of annual capital, taking this on from a government perspective, what that could do to the overall cost of borrowing to the province and the debt that we would have had at that time. It's hypotheticals, but those are all things that you have to consider. Yeah.
And the 10% on this bond, that was guaranteed for how many years?
Yeah, so 30-year bond.
30-year bond.
Yeah, and so when we make a lump sum payment to pay off the debt, we do get a benefit. We get a make whole, and we just look at the market conditions and what you would get for a bond of similar type. That's part of our bond agreement. So we will get we will pay the differential. So what's in the market today, and that 10% less, and that's what we'll pay on the outstanding debt.
Yes, Ms. Roberts is asking, touching on a very good point, is that in 1995-96, the government of Nova Scotia was in a very different position, accounting-wise, financially, fiscally, and the ability to borrow-wise than it is today. What was done in 1995-96 is not what we would do today. It's what we had to do then. I was just a baby then, and I don't know how old you were, Ms. Roberts, but not that old. The province was in a very, very difficult fiscal situation, and we didn't even know if they could borrow without a guaranteed revenue base. So what was actually done with this highway is what I would call the equivalent of having your parents sign a guarantee on your car loan when you're 16 or 18 years old. The toll revenue was the guarantee that the bondholders would get paid. Today, we would do it in a different format. So I think it's just important to understand that.
And just because I'm taking this opportunity to learn and understand things a bit better, when we issue government bonds, and here I think I will ask Mr. Spicer maybe to answer my question. When we issue government bonds now to finance a deficit in a given fiscal year, what's the interest rate and the guaranteed, how long is that interest rate guaranteed for?
Mr. Spicer.
That
it's very difficult. I think they're all different.
Okay.
I mean, you issue bonds and there's different rates and different time frames. So that would be extremely difficult for me to answer right now. That I would suggest the best people to answer that would probably be the Department of Finance. They would have all of that detail,
okay.
and or the Treasury Board.
Okay, but typically, I don't believe a government bond would be issued for a 30-year guarantee. That's not the length of time that we would be talking about guaranteeing a general government bond, I imagine.
I would agree with you.
Okay.
I think that would be but I think they do vary. So it's
Okay, thank you. I want to take advantage of the institutional knowledge represented by Mr. Fitzner, and again, because I wasn't a baby in 1997, but nor was I paying attention to government infrastructure investment. At the time that this project was undertaken, did we have the other 100 series twinned highways, or did they come after the Cobequid Pass project?
Mr. Fitzner.
So generally, most of the highways that had been twinned at that point were, we twin highways usually when the daily traffic volume started approaching 10,000 vehicles a day. So where that was typically happening was in closer to the Halifax urban area, right? So you would see the twinning that went to Truro, the 118 out to Fall River in the back of Dartmouth. And some pieces like that. So, at that time, it was really only around the urban core that there was twinning of all these sections, right? However, that particular road at the time, being sort of the gateway into the province, had the highest percentage of trucks of any road that we had in the province, right? And so that mix of trucks and vehicle traffic on a non-divided highway was a safety risk that, sort of manifested itself in what happened up there with the fatalities every year. And so, that's sort of where we were at the time. So this was a big project by those days' standards. And at that time, the federal government was starting to rein in its own spending. It was harder to come by the federal cash and this type of thing. So I think it was a solution that was good for the time, that the way they did it, because it happened quickly, but as Paul says, might not be the way we would do one today.
And would you say that was safety the primary reason for undertaking the project?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. I know in Alberta, they've moved to using high tension cable dividers on medians on larger highways with a lot of traffic volume. Is that something that Nova Scotia has ever considered?
Mr. Hackett.
Yeah, so we are looking at those for some of our twinned highways. We do have Council Causeway has one right now, and we have a couple others out there as well. So it is part of our toolbox or our design standards, yes.
Mr. LaFleche.
So that raises another good series of questions. So sometimes the solution, if it's lower volume, is not twinning, because the issue is head-on traffic, and it's the divider that's the problem. And the high-tension cables, or in cases where we have it, we have some concrete dividers. Those are solutions that could be used. Generally, here people immediately go to the twinning solution, which is a higher cost solution. So there's also the 2+1 highway solution, where we have a partial implementation of that in the region between Colebrook and Aylesford on the 101, although not a full solution because there's not a cable barrier or a concrete median. But there was a widening there, and there is a dotted 1 meter separation in the middle plus passing lanes. So those are solutions that we, the technical people, would encourage Nova Scotians to think about first before twinning, where the volume doesn't justify twinning. Unfortunately, they're not solutions you see a lot of here. So the public generally first, as in most cases in North America, they go to the twinning solution. Not always the best, not always the best for the taxpayer or the citizen. So we tend to put forward those solutions where possible. A lot of them are retrofits. You see some of the work that we've done on the Avon River Causeway. We're now twinning it. The announcement was on Monday. You might have heard that. But we are going, but prior to that, we put in some safety measures. We put in the cat's eyes. We put in speed radar monitor, things like that, rumble strips. So we put in things like that. So there are other solutions than twinning, and we like to use them, but the pressure is always on the twinning because it seems like a simple solution, and but it's costly.
There must also be, in terms of fatalities and public health, there must be at some point a trade-off between highway infrastructure and the public health outcomes. In that, I think, certainly something I've heard in my very urban constituency where people are concerned about active transportation and the safety of roads in an urban context. There's concern that Nova Scotia has actually overbuilt the 100 series highway such that, it seems like the majority of Nova Scotians can say that they live an hour from Halifax, because that's sort of true if you're in Truro, if you're in Windsor, or if you're in Tantallon or Chester. Everyone says that they're, why not buy a home out there because I'm just an hour from the city, and then everybody arrives in the city at the same time, and unless we, just become a city of highway, it doesn't work very well for the actual community. So I'd welcome your comment in terms of whether those are conversations that happen within the department, or maybe between the department and your political masters.
There's a political conversation there which I'm not going to bite on, but I will bite on the practical part of it, which is, when we twin, and we twin outwards from Halifax, we drive our urban sprawl, we drive the need to put in water, sewer, schools, health facilities, etc., which maybe some people feel are more costly than density on the peninsula. So this is really the area of HRM and their council and their people, but there is that debate, which we are a player in, but from a technical, not a political viewpoint, whether we should densify the peninsula, which is highly controversial, or whether we should contribute to more urban development through making it easier to drive in through twinned or tripled highways. So we provide technical advice in that debate, but we don't provide the political side of it, which I'm sure you and your colleagues can do.
Do you see any path forward from this point which would result in increased safety, but maybe lower traffic speeds that might make people consider twice? I mean, I think even the use of cables on a less wide highway, you could have single lanes with cables and accomplish many of the same safety outcomes, I think, as you do with twinning.
So those are options we present to politicians, and then they decide whether they like those or not. But we do present the safety aspects of it, the cost aspect of it, the engineering aspect of it. Sometimes, as Peter said earlier, when Mr. Houston asked those questions on the median, we are stuck because we don't have a lot of space. So technical innovations need to be done. So we provide information on all of that. We work with the Halifax Regional Municipality staff on things in Halifax in those cases. And as you know, we also do active transportation solutions in conjunction with municipalities. So we work on all of that.
We'll move back to the Liberal Caucus. Ms. Lonis-Croft.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm glad that members of the opposition are keen to talk about the future expenses of the province this week. Last week they were a little reluctant, but it's good they've seen the light. Anyway, who owns the Cobequid Pass?
Mr. Hackett.
So the province actually owns the Cobequid Pass. It's owned by, but it's run by the Highway 104 Corporation. So it is a government entity, and it's a provincial highway.
So the stakeholders are...
The only stakeholder, the one shareholder, is the Minister of Transportation. And that's it. And it's made up of one board member, which is the president of the CAPAS, which just so happens to be me today. And so that's the way the structure is set up. But it is run at arm's length from government in a way, so that they run their own operation, they collect their own tolls, they pay off their own bonds, they do their own maintenance and operations and all that sort of thing. So the department has, other than the structure I just gave you, the department has very little involvement with that. And even as Mr. LaFleche mentioned earlier, that the maintenance is done by us, but it's contracted by the PASS. So it's, even though it's our staff, it's PASS pays for it. So.
Okay, so commissions and agencies usually fall under the portfolio of the Minister of Business. Am I correct? And so,
Mr. LaFleche.
I've been in a few departments, and every department, not everyone, but many departments have crown corporations, bases, commissions, etc. There are a lot in some departments and fewer in others. I think you think of business because business has 4 big ones that everybody knows about, but you know, there's also others like Liquor Corp under the finance. We have Cobequid Pass and the Halifax Dartmouth Bridge Commission under us. So agriculture has many ABCs. In fact, a lot of commissions. The Apple Maggot Commission, I'll mention that one as an interesting one in case we always need members.
Okay, so those would be in your annual finances. You find them under your department. I've been told that the Cobequid Pass is not a 3P project, but it seems very similar. Can you explain how it's different from a P3?
P3 has really a broad definition, and some people don't really cotton on to my statement, but when we lease government office space, I mean, you're in a P3, so are you and you. You're in lease space in your caucus offices. So that's one extreme end of P3. And then, you know, another extreme end might be when it's totally contracted out, like some of the hospitals in Ontario are just total P3s, are operated by the private sector, maintained and run, and the only thing the government provides is the healthcare operating costs. So there's all sorts of P3s, there's a huge spectrum. I would define this as a P3, but you know, you could find some professor somewhere, maybe at Concordia University, who would go into economic theory and not define it as a P3 for some reason, but certainly we would consider this within the spectrum of P3s somewhere.
So how is it different? Is it because the bonds? Is that what?
No, I don't know. It's a type of P3, we would say, in that, first of all, there's probably multiple P3s here. Peter, sorry, maybe Bruce, you could describe how it was built, because that was a P3 in itself, how it was built.
Okay, I think we typically look at like our schools and our hospitals, you know, in the 3P model. So I think we're talking outside the regular thought on what P3s are. So go ahead, Mr.
Fitzner.
In this particular project, the private sector is involved because they raised over half of the funding to do the construction originally through the bond issue. So there was a company that was set up. It was Atlantic Highways Management Corporation or whatever they were called. They were a consortium that did both the construction and then looked after the financing of that share of the project, right? So I think you could probably say this clearly falls in the range of P3 because there was private money that came into it as opposed to all just government money.
Okay. So, when you say consortium of construction, I think of the Blue Nose.
No, okay. I take that word back if I can take it back. It was many of the contractors that did the work were from Nova Scotia, right? But it was such a big project that not one particular contractor could do it themselves. So they banded together several different of the large contractors to look after the work.
Okay, so the 20 months that it took to build, seems like a very short span of time for that length.
Extremely, yeah.
And would that be part and parcel because you had so many different groups working?
So, well, okay, for one thing is that when we typically do a project, we'll do a small piece. So for each of those pieces, we'll send out the bridges to get designed by bridge designers. We'll get the highway designed by highway designers. Every time they do it, it's slightly different. On the Cobequid Pass, they used the same, basically the same design for all the structures, right? So they replicated that same thing. So there was efficiencies by doing that. So the forms could be used over and again, like the form work to pour the concrete would be the same for each bridge. They move up the road, they'd get it done a little more efficiently, right? So it was by giving them that large piece of work and sort of just getting out of their way and let the road builders build it and us just oversee that they're meeting the standards. It allowed them to be more innovative and get things done quicker.
Okay.
At a guaranteed price, right? So they were on the hook for that.
Okay. So, when you talk about the people that work there, the 29 employees, you talked about there was a group from DOT that is dedicated to working that piece of the highway. So, will those people be absorbed back into your DOT, like they are NSEGU, I would assume, employees? They're CUPE, okay. So they would be absorbed back into the regular DOT, or would they, or you just don't know how it's going to look?
So they're actually,
Mr. LaFleche.
Sorry. They're part of the existing CUPE workforce. They're already absorbed in it. So the question really is, how are we going to do maintenance on the Cobequid Pass in the future? And that's one of the questions we're going to answer in different ways with different options when we do a presentation to Cabinet. So Mr. Fitzner and Ms. Saurette will put that together and talk about how would the 104 be maintained if we dropped some tolls, all tolls, whatever, et cetera, how would the future of maintenance be done, and that question will be answered. But those employees are existing government employees, CUPE, Canadian Union of Public Employees, with seniority. So the collective agreement governs, let's say we didn't use any of them on the Cobequid in the future. That's one end of the spectrum, an extreme decision, right? That's not maybe where we're going. We're presenting many options. They would be absorbed back. They're part of the system already. They don't get absorbed back. They're part of the system, and the collective agreement and their seniority determines what happens with them. Maybe we need them on some of the twinned highways we're building elsewhere if we don't use them on the Cobequid, etc. So that's a question we can't really answer today, right. But if I was one of those employees, I wouldn't be very worried about it because most of them would be veteran employees and they have rights under the collective agreement, and you know we've maintained these employees for a long time.
Okay, so you have dedicated employees. So do you have dedicated equipment that is just used for the Cobequid Pass?
Well, quite wonderfully, I'll let Mr. Hackett answer that, but there's a wonderful new truck we just bought up for the pass, so maybe you can describe that.
Mr. Hackett. It's a very expensive truck. It's a large truck. It's a double wing truck, so it's yeah, it's a very powerful truck for the snow up there. And we're using it on the pass. It's dedicated to the Londonderry base, I believe, but the gear up on the pass it's gear from Londonderry, it's gear from Oxford, and so it's only dedicated really through the winter time. So if there's snow and ice control, that sort of thing, they would come from those bases. But the gear is part of our inventory, and we use it for other things, other work in that area as well. So it's just not dedicated to the pass. But in a snow event, they are dedicated to the pass for snow events. Yes.
And that would also be for your summer maintenance program, like your bush cutting and your paving machines and whatnot. They would all be jointly used by the Londonderry
Oxford bases, yeah. And so basically the way it works is that the independent engineer would identify what issues would be needed for repair on the pass over the summer, and they would give the report to us, and we would look at it, and we'd send our staff out there to fix those items that they needed fixed.
Mr. LaFleche?
Yeah, the type of gear we use in different roads in different areas of Nova Scotia with different climate zones varies considerably. So the type of gear in the past would be a larger, more robust gear like we would have see in areas of New Brunswick. In order for us to consider contracting out something like that, I hate to use that word, someone has to buy a lot of gear or get a lot of gear, so there has to be sufficient scale to that. We found it most efficient, and that's why our own workers do the pass. It's most efficient for sections like that because we have the gear and we have the trained quality staff to do it ourselves. There are circumstances in other provinces, other jurisdictions, where they have contracted out that type of thing, but it's got to be a sufficient scale to do that. It can't just be one small section. So we'll see where that goes. We'll give advice on costing and equipment and maintenance to the government as part of the decision to go forward in the next within the next year, and they will make a decision on what to do.
Okay, thank you. And in that April of 2017 press release, where you said tolls will be considered being removed should the bonds be paid off, what factors play a part in making that decision?
Ms. Saurette?
The bonds being paid off, I think.
Can you just clarify that question? What factors in taking off the bonds?
Need to be considered before you look at paying off the bonds.
Oh, we have to, I think the biggest factor is making sure we have enough money to pay it off. Right. Okay. So, yeah.
But
Mr. LaFleche?
Sorry if I get... So previously Ms. Saurette mentioned weather and maintenance and any surprise disasters that come that we have to fix up would affect the cash flow towards getting enough cash for the bonds. But there are other questions too, and this is where I'm going to use up your time for Mr. Houston, because he alluded to the legislation. So that brings the whole question. We have to wrap up all the agreements. We have to change the legislation, maybe get rid of it or modify it. All of this takes time. As you know, legislation has to go through a session of the legislature. So these things have to be done in an appropriate way with due diligence on behalf of Nova Scotians, so we do the best we can for Nova Scotians. So some people say, well, why don't the tolls come off tomorrow? Well, because of all these agreements and the legislation, it takes time to wind these things up appropriately so things are done in a legal way, in a way which best benefits Nova Scotians. So those are the things that need to be put in place to ensure that sometime around 2019, as was alluded to by Minister McClellan, the tolls do come off for Nova Scotia motorists.
And I think I heard someone say that you must return it in the condition that it was built.
Yeah, there's various, I think you have a copy of the agreement, do they not, in the package?
We have of the Act.
Of the Act, okay. Yes. Well, there is an agreement too, and in the agreement it has certain specifications, and if we end the agreement early, prior to 2026, we have to, so to speak, negotiate that ending, right? And then there's all the things we've just talked about, plus other things that Mr. Houston brought up related to the speed limits on and the situation on Old Highway 4. So all of that is part of the discussions we need to have with the bondholders when we wrap this up, and it'll take a little time.
Order. Time has expired.
Oh, okay.
Mr. LaFleche and Mr. Hackett, you have a couple of minutes to provide some closing statements.
I guess I want to focus on the date. We were asked early on about when the tolls would come off, and there was a lot of focus on the legal date of the original act and the bondholder agreement, which is 2026. But I think it's necessary to assure the listeners that we are striving to meet Minister McClellan, Minister Hines, and the Premier's commitment of when the bonds are paid off. Ms. Saurette has reiterated that will be sometime in fiscal 1920, so that's when it will happen. So there should not be a big focus on 2026, other than us wrapping up the agreement, which happens to have that date in it.
Thank you. Any other comments? Mr. Hackett, did you want to provide some closing comments?
I can just, I'll just say that, basically back to my opening remarks, is that you know, the pass provides a safe transportation to the province of Nova Scotia, and it was built for that purpose. And so it is a safe highway for folks coming from away or coming traveling in the province. It's a safe highway for trucks and all the economics for the province as well. And so I think with that and the efficiency of the road, as we mentioned earlier, and the fact that we're in a dilemma here with we're 10 years ahead of ourselves in these bonds looking like they could be paid out. I think that's kind of a success story for the province. I think the whole thing wrapped up as one that we can be proud of. So I just want to put that in closing.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being with us today and answering our questions. And it was a prop-free day. We have just one item of committee business. We had correspondence from the Department of Health and Wellness. That was information requested from the December 13th meeting. Any questions or comments on the correspondence? No? Okay, our next meeting is January 24th. It is to discuss tourism in Nova Scotia, and it is with Tourism Nova Scotia. So we will see you then. This meeting is now adjourned.